you are able-bodied and you feel willing and able to stand for the next hour, hour and a half before we start our mingling, please do give up your seat for people who would prefer to be seated for the next 2 hours. So we'll use the next 1 minute to do a little shuffling. If you feel you need a seat, please find one. If you feel you don't need a seat, please stand. And then we'll figure it out from there. We'll start in 1 minute. Thank you. All right, thanks for that shuffling. So now we have seats open, which is how that works. So if you now would like to fill in the seats, I'd much rather people are seated than standing. So now I encourage you to not be shy and to please take seats, especially, let's say, if you're in the back corner, especially if you're near a chair. If a chair is near you, just take it. There's one in the front. There's another here. As many of you as can sit, if you would like to sit, I really encourage you to do that now. Or forever hold your peace. Okay, are we filming? Great. So, welcome, everybody. It's great to see everybody here. My name is Dvorit. I'm the director of Manylabs. This is a Manylabs event. We are talking tonight about marine sequestration, so hopefully you are in the right place. I would like to thank Jay Wilson from our Manylabs community for filming tonight. Thank you very much, Jay. Came in the last moment to help us out. We had a lot of requests to film this event. I'm very grateful that he stepped in to help us. Just some housekeeping details. There's a bathroom in that alcove just over there to the corner. If you need water instead of the soda and beers that we've provided, there are glasses and water in the kitchen. Just please wash your glass if you choose to drink out of a glass from the kitchen here. We also have snacks and drinks, and throughout the presentation, if you'd like to help yourself, I encourage you. And there will also be time after the presentations for about the last half hour that we're here to continue mingling and snacking. So make yourselves comfortable while you're here. Tonight we're being hosted by the Schmidt Marine Technology Partners Office. I'm very grateful that they stepped in. Some of you know that we lost a venue, which for anyone who hosts events knows it can be very nerve-wracking. I'd like to thank Mike Biddle for the introduction, and very much would like to thank Michael Shen for being so supportive and setting us up. And Michael would like to speak just briefly about Schmidt Marine, and I would like to introduce Michael so that you know how awesome it is that he's been here to help us. Michael is a program analyst for Schmidt Marine. He analyzes new ocean technology solutions to see whether they're economically viable and environmentally beneficial. He went to Cal Berkeley. He has a BA in integrative biology. He previously worked as a financial systems analyst at the Schmidt Ocean Institute, a sister nonprofit entity of Schmidt Marine. He is particularly interested in the prevention of plastic pollution, as well as the development of inexpensive sensors for research. So please help me welcome our host, Michael.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to keep this very brief. I'm sorry, I'm a little sick, actually, a little under the weather. But my name is Michael. I work for Schmidt Marine Technology Partners, a program of the Schmidt Family Foundation. I'm actually part of a larger team. Mark Schroep, my director, and Jake Hamp, the other analyst, unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but glad that you're all here. This is a fantastic a set of presentations we'll have tonight, so very excited. Quick spiel about Schmidt Marine Technology Partners. We fund early stage innovative technologies for marine conservation. We're agnostic to nonprofits and for-profits. We try to work with groups that are early stage and really just working out of the garages, coming up with this the concept for the prototype and really getting it out there. We try to de-risk these technologies so that they can become attractive to future investors. We focus on plastic pollution, as mentioned, sustaining fisheries, enabling ocean research, and habitat health, which are just these categories that we look at, how we look at these technologies. So if you have any questions about that, or if you're interested, or if you think you know someone who might have an interesting technology that we should be aware of, feel free to come up to me afterwards and we can have a quick chat, or email me at mshen@schmidtmarine.org. I encourage you all to check out our website. I also encourage you all to look at the job board on our website. We partner with a group called Monday, so we work with local nonprofits that are working in the ocean sector, and we post their job postings on our website. It's a fantastic, quick read to look through. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. I would be remiss if I did not mention that today is Martin Luther King Day, and I want to thank you all for being here on a holiday. Manylabs does not focus on racial justice or racial equity, but I believe very strongly that climate change is something that is going to not only impact all of us, but disproportionately is going to impact people of color who perhaps do not have the same access to resources and safety nets that some of us in this room do. So I would just like to point out that in honor of this day, we think about how we can bring people of diverse voices into the room when we talk about climate change, how we can think about hearing their voices, making sure their voices are heard, how we can think about making sure that the programs that we put on as environmental specialists are including all people, not just the people who look like ourselves. So thank you for being here on this holiday, and hopefully that message resonates with you. So what does Manylabs specifically focus on? We started off most recently as an organization for science enthusiasts with a co-working makerspace on Folsom Street. Our founder, Peter Sand, is in the room. Hello, Peter. More recently, Manylabs has pivoted in the last year to focus specifically on climate change technologies. And within that, we're even more hyper-focused on carbon sequestration and utilization. So we have an event series that we run every month, and also a very active online virtual community. So for example, there are many people in the room right now who are in our Slack channel, and if you are one of those people, will you raise your hand? Wow. So that's a lot of people. And thank you for being here. And then in addition to our events and our Slack channel, we also have a website where we publish lots of resources for people who work within the climate change and carbon spaces. Manylabs is reaching sort of a turning point, and I would love to chat with any of you about that afterwards. There may or may not be a special announcement that we may or may not make in February. I'll sort of leave it at that. But if we don't make that announcement, then it's possible that this might be the last Manylabs event. And we've built some incredible momentum this year, and it's just, you know, sort of indicative of how many people are in this room, how many people RSVP'd, and how many people requested that we film it because they would love to hear what we have to talk about, not only tonight, but every month when we talk about different topics. So if you're really curious about what you can do to make sure we do or do not make that announcement next month, I would love to talk to you. Please let me know. So why are we doing an oceans event? Well, we previously were talking about what we called biological sequestration, and we were focusing on soils, forests, and farms. And you know, when you host events and there's sort of an online forum, sometimes people speak their mind. And Greg Rao posted, well, how can you talk about biological sequestration and not talk about oceans? And I thought, oh, Greg, you're next. And so here he is to talk to us tonight. So you be careful what you wish for, or you know, wish loudly, I guess is the other way to put that. So tonight we're shifting our focus. As we talk about carbontech, we're going deep sea. So just very quickly, the last things I want to say to give a brief further introduction about oceans is that you may have seen Science reported just this last week that since the predictions that they made in 2013 about ocean warming, the waters are actually warming 40% faster than we had expected. And what I learned today in doing a little bit of research is that oceans absorb 93% of the heat within our climate systems. But what happens is that oceans have a very long memory, meaning they're not going to cool very quickly. So we need to obviously reduce the amount of greenhouse gases, we need to reduce the amount of warming, but what's going to happen is that the oceans are going to stay warmer longer. So we need to be thinking quite a bit about how to reverse global warming through carbon sequestration. And of course, when we think about carbon sequestration, we have to think about the oceans because not only are they warming, but they're also one of our greatest solutions to reversing that warming. Whether it's through their minerals, whether it's through their plants, we'll hear obviously quite a bit about that tonight. So oceans are not only a measure of climate change, but they're also a solution, and the solution is what we're going to focus on tonight. So the content, we'll have two speakers tonight, Greg Rao and Will Burns. I'll be introducing Greg first. He will speak, including a brief Q&A for 20 minutes. We'll shift speakers. He will speak for 20 minutes, including Q&A. And then given any time that's left, we'll do a Q&A as well. So I'll be helping to moderate, and I know you'll have many questions. But if we do run out of time, I want there still to be an opportunity for everyone to mix and mingle. So we will be ending the formal presentation at 7:30. Sound good? Sounds good. Okay. So to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Greg Rao is a senior research scientist with the Institute of Marine Sciences at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and is also a visiting scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. With a background in the study of natural carbon cycling, he has become increasingly involved in the CO2 management R&D over the past 20 years. He has written over 130 articles on the preceding topics and holds 5 patents. In 2018, Greg was a finalist in the Keeling Curve Prize. During 2014 and 2015, he served as a judge for the Wendy Schmidt Ocean Health X Prize, which is associated with the Schmidt Marine Center where we are today. He has also been an advisor and consultant for the International Maritime Organization, the Ocean Solutions Group, the National Academy of Sciences, and other organizations, if you can believe he has time for that. Finally, Dr. Rao is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So I hope you can tell from that introduction we are very lucky to hear from him tonight on this topic. Please help me welcome Dr. Rao.
Well, thank you, Devorit. Thank you so much for your organizational skills here and bringing all these people here. And thanks to Schmidt Marine for hosting this, providing the venue. And thank you all for coming. I mean, it was a 3-day weekend, and you guys should be driving back from your 3-day weekend, but obviously you decided to come here instead. So Will and I will try to make it worth your while. I think my job here is just to provide you with an overview of how the ocean might participate in helping us manage atmospheric CO2. Hopefully we'll really get into the weeds through your comments and questions. So I'm just going to try to give you a brief overview of this topic, and then we'll go wherever you want to go in terms of the details. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so we're going to talk about marine-based management. And obviously you don't need to hear about why we need to manage atmospheric CO2, but the issue is how we're going to do that. Now this is a scenario, several scenarios here for what our emissions should look like if we're going to achieve a 1.5 total warming, 1.5 degrees C total warming. I'll just focus you on this graph. This is actually a graph of what is required in terms of atmospheric CO2 concentration. This blue line represents what we need to do to stay below 1.5 degrees. The red line is 2 degrees. And so we're talking about, we're already, say, at 410 right now. So it doesn't take, we're almost there at 1.5 degree warming. So clearly we're going to overshoot here and have to come back down, and that's more or less what these graphs show, is that we no longer have the luxury of hitting either 1.5 or even 2 degrees by simply managing or reducing our emissions. We're now beyond the point where it's really realistic that that's going to happen. And we now also need to consider how we're going to actively remove atmospheric CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's what these graphs are about. These are various scenarios. If we really rapidly reduce our CO2, we don't have to do a lot of negative emissions to account for this overshoot that's shown in this yellow line. But if we go much higher than this and it extends beyond, say, 2020 here, we're going to have to do a lot of negative emissions in order to wind up with this kind of a scenario. So, so what this means is that we need to do 2 things. One, we need to quickly reduce our emissions, and we also need to figure out how we're going to actively remove atmospheric CO2. Now, in the one case, we sort of know how to do this. We know there's all sorts of renewable energy and also land use practices we could modify to do this, but we've procrastinated in doing that, and we still need to do it, but it's not going to be sufficient. On the other side here, we are going to need to remove some atmospheric CO2. But there's very little practice in doing that, and it's still up in the air exactly what technologies or methods we're going to use here. Now, in terms of terminology, carbon dioxide removal is sort of the overarching term. You can also use negative emissions. Negative emissions technologies has a clear technology tone to it, which carbon dioxide removal doesn't necessarily always have. But those are the two terms I'll be using tonight and what's normally used in the literature. Now, there's another way to counter global warming, and that's solar radiation management. I'm not going to talk about that. Maybe that's a topic for the future, but that's another thing that's being actively considered. Anyway, bottom line, it's all hands on deck here. Can we actually do this? Can we do it in time? And shouldn't we be considering the oceans here in this effort, considering that it composes 70% of the Earth's surface? Uh-oh. That wasn't good. Okay, well, there is some good news on the CDR side of this, and that is that nature naturally does a significant amount of carbon dioxide removal on an annual basis. This is the Keeling curve showing the increase in atmospheric CO2 starting in, I believe it was the late 50s here, on up to the present. Actually, these numbers were taken last week, so they're pretty up to date here. As you can see, this generally increases, but in an annual basis, there is this up and down motion. So there are periods in the year when atmospheric CO2 actually declines quite significantly, like 5 parts per million. So clearly there are things going on here that absorb CO2 and override more or less continuous emissions of atmospheric CO2. And these drawdown processes happen both on land and in the ocean. Unfortunately, these drawdown processes are leaky, and so a lot of this carbon that's initially absorbed will leak back out, either through biological respiration or back out in the ocean as they warm. But nevertheless, there's some encouraging evidence here that actually CDR is possible. The question is, can we significantly increase this, and can we reduce the leakiness here? And can we do this by either increasing these natural processes and or adding to these processes, either artificial or otherwise? The oceans have played a significant role historically in absorbing our excess CO2. This is a graph put together by the IPCC, and you can see that cumulatively the oceans have done a major job here, actually the primary job in absorbing CO2. Land, less so. That's largely due to land use, disturbance, loss of carbon as a consequence of that, although more recently it's gaining here. But one reason to consider the oceans in CO2 management is obviously it's played a significant role already in that, in a natural form. However, there is a very important negative impact of doing that. The way the oceans absorb most of this carbon is just through passive diffusion from the atmosphere into the ocean. And that occurs because as we add CO2 to the atmosphere, there's a partial pressure gradient set up. There's more CO2 in air than in water under equilibrium conditions. So the CO2 just naturally passively diffuses into the ocean. But unfortunately, it doesn't stay in molecular form. It very quickly hydrates to form carbonic acid. And that's not a good thing because the oceans are acidifying, and pH and acidity is a very important controlling constituent biogeochemical component in the ocean. This is, again, the Keeling curve from Mauna Loa, and a couple 100 miles away, or 100 miles away or so, there's the Hawaii Ocean Observation Time Series HOTS site, and they've monitored the PCO2 in the water at this site as well as the pH. And as you can see, the CO2 has gone up in these waters, and concomitantly the pH has declined and acidity has increased. Overall, from pre-industrial times to the present, it's about 1/10 of a unit of pH that has declined, and you say, well, what's the big deal there? Well, if your blood pH drops by 1/10 of a unit, you're dead. So these are logarithmic units, and actually this represents something like a 30% increase in ocean pH, which is obviously very significant. So we have to worry about what the impacts of this are having on the ocean biogeochemistry. And one of the most prominent things that have been looked at is the effects on calcification. It becomes difficult for shell-forming organisms to make their shells as pH declines, as acidity increases. It also, the preservation of the shell they have becomes more difficult as it becomes more acidic. So this is it's going to be impacting shell-forming organisms. Turns out that not all the species are affected equally. There's some winners and losers here, but at the very least, if this continues, we're going to change the species composition of these organisms, and probably many others that we have yet to learn about. The other reason to consider the ocean is that it forms the vast majority of the carbon that's already stored on the planet. Something like 85% of the Earth's surface carbon is in the ocean as mineral bicarbonate, as I'll talk about in a minute. So another reason to think about the oceans here, it is a huge reservoir of carbon, and we could actually put all of the atmospheric CO2 in it and it would hardly make any difference. So another reason that it wouldn't be wise to ignore the ocean here in our carbon management efforts. So what exactly can we do in the ocean to help our CO2 problem? Well, on the emissions side, there is a lot of renewable energy potential out there, something like 2 million terawatts per year, some people estimate. That's in a variety of forms, wind, wave, etc. Actually, the biggie is thermal. The thermal gradient in the ocean actually composes most of this potential. So we're not energy limited, we're not renewable energy limited, and if we choose to, we could supply all of our energy from the ocean. There are some issues in doing that, obviously. Logistically, it's difficult to get the ocean on the energy onshore, and there's some cost issues as well. But nevertheless, the potential is there for the ocean to contribute very significantly to our reduction in CO2 emissions. On the CDR side of things, I first want to give you a little taxonomy here of what the various kinds of CDR, and this applies to terrestrial as well as marine. So we have our dilute sources that we'd like to operate on. We've talked about air, but we could also talk about removing it from the ocean, soils, volcanic stuff, etc. We need to talk about a capture process, how this stuff is absorbed, and I'll talk about the three methods. We have primary products, and those can either be stored or there can be secondary products that are made from them. So first column here is biology. Clearly plants and microbes, autotrophs, can absorb CO2 and form biomass. If we store that, we then have sequestered it from the atmosphere. We, of course, can make other things from that biomass that might function as storage. We have to be careful about fuels and food because those quickly return CO2 to the atmosphere. So we've got to think about things other than this if we're going to actually sequester the carbon. Another method is called direct air capture. It also can involve CCS. The characteristic here is that it's abiotic, it's usually thermochemical, and it makes concentrated CO2. You can store that underground, or you can convert that to other things that can store the carbon. Third column here are chemical geochemical reactions. Mineral bases will react with CO2. Make carbonates and bicarbonates either in dissolved or solid form. These can be stored or they can be converted to other uses as well. And since it's early days in this technology, let's always keep an open mind. There may be other things out there that I don't know about, other people don't know about, so that's important. Whoops, let's see here. Now, there are a variety of potential synergies and hybrids here from these three main things that could be used. I guess the classic example is biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. This uses plant biomass and combusts that to generate energy. and then captures the CO2, forming concentrated CO2 that then stored underground. Or you can do a sort of a reverse process. You can capture the CO2, make concentrated CO2, feed that to plants or microbes and make biomass and store that. And likewise, there are a variety of potential, if not realized, synergies and hybrids here that could be explored and need to be. So specifically on the marine CO2 consumption approach, various methods have been proposed. The idea here, again, is that we want to consume CO2 using photosynthesis and form biomass, hopefully storing that. We have to keep in mind that biology tends to like to recycle carbon and not store it. It likes to also reverse this process, respire the biomass to form CO2. So we need to consider this in our attempts to boost photosynthesis, if that's the plan. We don't want to simply have it respired back to CO2 and go back into the atmosphere. So the two basic kinds, you can do this. You can increase the photosynthesis of microbes, or you can increase the photosynthesis of, or abundance of, macrophytes, that is multicellular marine plants like seagrass, kelp, etc. And in both of those cases, you do have to figure out how the carbon is actually going to be stored, and you want to avoid, obviously, recycling that back to the atmosphere. Whoops, oh, I did it again. Okay, let's see here. So some issues here, as I pointed out, biomass tends to quickly degrade, so you're going to have to intervene if you really want to do efficient storage. If you're going to sink this into the deep ocean, it's going to degrade there potentially, and that's going to affect the oxygen levels as well as the acidity at depth. That's something you might want to avoid if you care about the deep ocean. Nutrients, if you're going to add nutrients to do this, you've got to come up with a source of those. You also have to consider that whatever you add, there will be additional nutrients that are already in the ocean that will be stripped out. And so what's the fate of those, and how is that going to affect the biogeochemistry downstream from this? And last but not least, what are the impacts of this going to be to existing marine ecosystems? So the issue here is there a way that we can use marine biology in a way that doesn't disrupt the existing ecosystems there, and does it in a safe and cost-effective way? And I think that's an open question. I think the use of biotech and synthetic biology here could hold a lot of potential for allowing us to fine-tune the biology here specifically for CO2 management, and to avoid some of the side impacts that natural systems often have. Another method is CO2 extraction. You can or methods of actually removing CO2 from seawater. You can purge it with a CO2 depleted gas. There's electrodialysis that you can do. And if you remove the CO2 so that it is below atmospheric CO2 pressure, you then created a carbon sink, and therefore atmospheric CO2 will invade into the seawater. Obviously, you've got to figure out a way of storing the carbon that you remove from the ocean. So that's an issue here. And some of the issues that are associated with this method, typically it's energy intensive. You've got to use renewable energy ideally to do this. There could be downstream environmental impacts of doing this stripping that you'd want to look at carefully. How the CO2 is going to be stored, that's important. And likely this is only going to be applicable at local scales, but let's find out. The last method I'll talk about is chemical or geochemical ways of consuming and storing CO2. Basically, if you have an acid like carbonic acid, you can react that with a chemical base and form a neutral salt. So in this case, we've got carbonic acid, we've hydrated our CO2, we expose that to sodium hydroxide, and we make, in this case, sodium bicarbonate. There are a bunch of synthetic chemicals that you can use to do this kind of reaction. They can be formed electrochemically, or you can calcine minerals, etc. Or you can use natural minerals. It turns out the Earth's crust is mostly composed of alkaline minerals, and they can be used in this process, such as shown here. Downside is that this tends to be very slow. The kinetics here are much, much slower than if you're using synthetic materials. So the game here is, if you're going to use this natural cheap base, you've got to figure out ways of actually speeding this up, how to speed this up to make it relevant on human timescales.
Right, speaking of speeding up, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. This is the reason why the ocean is so carbon rich, because of this weathering of alkaline minerals. I guess my light's gone out. So this happens on the timescales of 100,000 years. The consequence is that you form bicarbonates in the ocean. That is largely the form of carbon in the ocean. Long time scales that will precipitate out and form carbonate that then eventually comes back to the Earth's surface to be re-weathered. I've worked on a method of accelerating this weathering using electrochemistry. We've developed a method of adding, a way of tweaking actually the electrochemistry here to form excess hydroxide that then can be used to capture CO2. This process also actually requires the generation of hydrogen. We split water, which obviously this is a important energy source, or could be an important energy source, and also for energy storage, or it could be used in hydrocarbon fuel synthesis. If you power this with renewable energy, you have a system that's strongly negative emissions, and so this is really a negative emissions hydrogen concept, and which potentially has very high capacity if we were to do this globally. Let's see here. I'll skip over this. These are some issues associated with chemical, geochemical processes. We can get into that if you want to. To wrap this up, as I pointed out, the ocean has significant potential to absorb and store carbon. It also could play a significant role in reducing our emissions through the use of the renewable energy that's out there. Most of the CDR that I've talked about is very preliminary. There may be lab demonstrations. Ocean fertilization actually has been done at medium scales, but most of the other stuff has not been. So there's a lot of R&D to really prove the cost effectiveness and safety of these things, and we need policy and markets to really support evaluating this. And I'll just put in a plug here. I'm the manager of the founder and manager of the Carbon Dioxide Google Group. If you're interested in this topic, not just marine, but the whole CDR thing, please send me an email. I'll be happy to include you in this mail list. It's a discussion group. You can listen in or contribute as you like. And we have almost 300 members now worldwide. So it's at times a very lively group. So thanks for your attention, and happy to answer questions.
So you jumped over your money shot slide back about on the accelerating carbon formation. And so I'm curious, like, could you talk a little bit more about what you
Which one?
One forward.
Sure.
The work that you did in your lab. No, you're going backwards. Here. Okay. So I'm curious if you could speak a little more about the different strategies that you considered for accelerating carbonate formation, and go into some more details on why you chose this route.
Yeah, well, I chose this route because... Yeah, well, the issue is clearly kinetics. Minerals do not react rapidly with atmospheric concentration CO2. So the issue is, how are we going to speed that up? Various ways to do that. You can grind up the minerals very finely, put them in the ocean. They'll actually speed up on a volumetric basis the absorption of CO2. You can use temperature. You can break them apart. You can do various chemistries to try to accelerate that. What I struck upon was the fact that when you electrolyze water, you generate acid, at least in one part of the electrolysis. And alkaline minerals dissolve in acid. So if you're able to generate an acid, you can dissolve that and therefore absorb that acid that would otherwise neutralize the hydroxide that's formed at the other electrode. If you don't allow the electrolysis cell then to neutralize the hydroxide that it's producing, it will just continue to increase. And so what we found was that this thing was a net hydroxide generator. My light is out. But anyway, we tweak this using base minerals to neutralize the acid so that we generate excess hydroxide. And as I pointed out, this is very reactive with CO2, and then we form calcium or magnesium bicarbonate. Now keep in mind this is in dissolved form. If you want solid carbonate, you can have it, but the problem there is you're losing one of the carbons off of this. You'll notice that there are 2 carbons tacked onto either a magnesium and a calcium. If you really insist on solid carbonate, you're going to lose one of those carbons back to the atmosphere. Plus, this form of carbon is useful for countering ocean acidity. It's an alkaline material, and if you add that to the ocean, you're helping counter the effects of the acidity there. You're adding to the carbonate saturation state of the ocean, as well as providing a storage vehicle for the carbon. So my preference here is to make bicarbonate. But as I say, if there is a commercial value for carbonate, and that would really justify losing the efficiency of the carbon that you've already captured here, that's fine. You can do that. But my preference is to make bicarbonate in solution.
We'll take the rest of the very quick follow-up, then we're going to move on.
So if you were to combust the H2
Mm-hmm.
in a 25% efficiency heat cycle engine, what percentage of the energy would you have from the cycle?
We've calculated. I don't have that off the top of my head, but it obviously makes this capture much more efficient than, say, a direct air capture thing, because you're able to recover some of the energy used in this. And also, I wouldn't recommend using a combined cycle here. I would recommend using a fuel cell. That would be a lot more efficient. Yeah, so I argue that this is going to be a lot more efficient than direct air capture, and also BECCS, just because of the efficiencies, and you're not having to deal with concentrated CO2 and figuring out what to do with it.
Right. Thank you so
Okay.
much. I feel like that could be an entire university course. You all got your first A for listening. I wish we had more time to ask Greg questions right away, but there'll be a little bit of time at the end to circle back to his presentation. But let's move on from the science overview more towards the policy, law, and ethics side of marine sequestration. So next up is Dr. Will Burns, who is a professor of research and founding co-executive director of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University in Washington, D.C. Prior to this, he served as the founding co-executive director of the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment and director of the Energy Policy and Climate Program at Johns Hopkins University. He also serves as the co-chair of the International Environmental Law section of the American branch of the International Law Association. Previously, he served as president of the Association of Environmental Studies and Sciences. His research agenda includes climate geoengineering, the effectiveness of the European Union's emissions trading system, and climate adaptation mechanisms within international climate treaties. No small stuff. He received his PhD in international law from the University of Wales Cardiff School of Law. Please help me welcome Dr. Will Burns.
Thank you very much for coming. Let's get this out of my way before I fall. Okay, so Greg gave you an overview of some of the options that we're looking at in this field. While we've called this carbon dioxide removal and marine sequestration, in the world policy community, virtually all of these things have been categorized as climate geoengineering or marine geoengineering. And so what I want to look at is how the world community is seeking to regulate both the research and the potential deployment of these technologies and how they might proceed in the future. What I want to do is I want to start off by emphasizing that there's no consolidated international regime that regulates these things. There's what we call a polycentric sort of network of different treaties that have decided that they have an interest in this and have made decisions that may be important, both in terms of what we've done in the past and moving forward. And so I want to look at some of those institutions and what they've said to date and how they might regulate these things in the future. So the first treaty that we start off with has a very long name, but it's usually referred to as the London Dumping Convention. And this treaty was created in the 1970s primarily to regulate the dumping of materials in the world's oceans that were deemed to be potentially deleterious. In the last decade, Greg had indicated that there was a series of field experiments related to one carbon sequestration process called ocean iron fertilization. The idea here is that there's a shortage of a critical micronutrient in some of the world's oceans, that being iron, and that if we were to seed the world's oceans with more iron, it would increase phytoplankton productivity, take in carbon dioxide, and ultimately some of that carbon dioxide would drop to the bottom of the ocean when the species died and be sequestered there for hundreds of years. The London Dumping Convention was terribly concerned about the potential environmental impacts of this kind of operation. And so in 2008, it passed a resolution to address this issue. Resolution in 2008 called for several things. First of all, notably, it said that if you were placing iron in the world's oceans, it didn't constitute dumping. Because it was for a purpose other than disposing of those materials. So in some ways, that was good news. At the same time, it created some very cautionary language in terms of how these operations could proceed. As you can see here, it says that scientific research proposals should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. Okay? And it also said that the present state of knowledge that we have means that we should only conduct legitimate scientific research and no other activities, meaning that any commercial operations or large-scale deployment would not be permitted. Okay? It also established, as we said, a risk assessment framework, and this is a broad collection of the parameters for that. And so the idea is that if a country wants to authorize one of its nationals to conduct these operations, it has to provide them with a permit, and it first has to engage in this risk assessment procedure. Okay? Now, some NGOs and policymakers have said this constitutes a moratorium on marine geoengineering, but it clearly does not. Right? It authorizes scientific research. It emphasizes, however, that currently we do not know enough to allow large-scale operations, and it's contemplated that this research will continue. Now, there were limitations to this resolution. Resolutions that are passed by the London Convention are not legally binding. Okay, some minor details. And so the parties said we need to do more than this to ensure the viability of this approach. So they had established another agreement under the London Convention called the London Protocol. And the idea is eventually that the protocol will supplant the London Convention. It has much stronger provisions for protecting the world's environments in terms of dumping. And as part of the protocol, one of the things that they did in 2013 is they passed an amendment to the protocol specifically related to marine geoengineering. Okay, and there's several things that you should note about this resolution. First of all, it indicates that you should not be allowed to engage in marine geoengineering research or deployment unless there's a permit for those activities or those kinds of marine geoengineering that are listed in this Annex 4. Okay? Annex 4 at this point allows you to engage in these operations if you're granted a permit, again by a country, and you engage in a risk assessment, a procedure. At this point, there's only one kind of marine geoengineering activity that's regulated under this protocol, and that's ocean iron fertilization. Okay? However, if you look at the definition of marine geoengineering, it is so expansive that it's contemplated that if there were other kinds of marine geoengineering research that might occur in the future, including some of the things that Greg discussed, we could amend this provision and include them in Annex 4. And in those cases, it would require a permit to proceed with those activities, and it would require a risk assessment procedure to be put in place and published at the end of that process. Okay? Now, even though the protocol is stronger in some ways, because this would be a legally binding mandate under the treaty, there's still some limitations to it. The biggest limitation is that to amend the protocol and include these provisions, you have to have 2/3 of the parties to the protocol agree to it. And that would be, at this point, about 34 countries. So far, we've only had 4 countries that have agreed to it, right? So it's far from reaching a point where it would be legally binding in terms of what it calls for. The other thing is that this treaty is restricted to the placement of materials by vessels, by aircraft, et cetera, of materials into the oceans. And so while it would encompass a number of the marine geoengineering approaches that we're talking about, including things like ocean alkalinization, for example, or ocean iron fertilization, there are some activities that might not fall into that category. For example, there's discussion of using pipes to try to upwell or downwell nutrients to try to increase productivity in the oceans. Arguably, that's utilizing materials or things that are already in the ocean, and it's not adding processes, and might not fall under the category of the London Convention. Okay, so that's one treaty that's tried to look at this. A second treaty that also became involved during the time when ocean iron fertilization began to be developed is the Convention for Biological Diversity. The Convention for Biological Diversity was established in 1992 to try to arrest the catastrophic decline in biodiversity, and it has various provisions to seek to protect species both in situ and ex situ. In 2008, the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity passed a decision. And this decision, as you can see here, indicates that there should be, quote, no climate-related geoengineering activities that may affect biodiversity until there's an adequate scientific basis on which to justify those activities. And that currently, the only thing that should be allowed is, quote unquote, small-scale scientific research studies conducted in a controlled setting. Okay? Now, small scale was not defined. Controlled setting was not defined. And arguably, that ambiguity reflects the fact that the convention was not well qualified to understand climate geoengineering, and in many ways, it's continued to defer to the London Convention, at least in terms of what the risk assessment procedure should look like. But the convention has also continued to talk about this issue. In 2012, for example, it also passed another decision that talks about climate geoengineering more expansively, and it's indicated that geoengineering could include, quote, any technologies that deliberately reduce solar insolation or increase carbon sequestration. And so it now goes beyond merely looking at ocean iron fertilization and indicates that any ocean geoengineering activity should be restricted to controlled settings with a scientific purpose only. So no commercial operations, for example, or any large-scale deployment, at least currently. However, in 2016, it also once again emphasized, quote unquote, that more transdisciplinary research and sharing of knowledge is needed to better understand the impacts of climate-related geoengineering. So again, while many seek to claim that the Convention on Biological Diversity has also placed a moratorium on climate geoengineering research, that's not the case. And in fact, I'd argue quite the opposite. They've argued the need for additional scientific research to assess impacts. Okay, so it's a precautionary approach, but certainly not a preclusionary approach, I think, in all cases. Now, what other regimes might in the future look at climate geoengineering? There's a number of them, and so I want to look at a couple of them very briefly. The first of these is what we call UNCLOS, so the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is the so-called Constitution of the Oceans that was established in the 1990s to protect the ocean environment, to regulate navigation in the ocean, the extraction of minerals, et cetera. Okay? It has 167 countries that are members of it, and so it's an important international regime, though notably one country that's not a party to it is the United States. Under Article 192, there's a general obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. So any marine geoengineering activity that potentially has negative environmental impacts could potentially be subject to regulation under the Law of the Sea Convention. More specifically, Article 194 talks about taking measures to prevent, reduce, and control, quote unquote, pollution of the marine environment. And it's possible that some of the activities that we're talking about in terms of marine sequestration of carbon could create pollution. For example, ocean alkalinization could potentially precipitate calcium hydroxide. It could also alter primary and secondary productivity, which could concentrate metals such as chromium and nickel, arguably construed as pollutants, and it could be regulated under the Law of the Sea Convention. That means that a party who believed that there were impacts, negative impacts, either in the open ocean or in their coastal areas, could bring an action under the Law of the Sea to contest those activities in the future. And the definition of pollution is quite broad, right? Introduction by man directly or indirectly of substances or energy into the marine environment, including to estuaries. And so it could encompass, it would be wide in terms of scope and potential range of activities that would fall under that rubric. Now, the Paris Agreement, right? This is the medium-term and long-term international instrument to address climate change. What role might marine sequestration play in the Paris Agreement? Well, first of all, we know that the temperature targets that we've established, right, holding temperatures to well below 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees Celsius, and aspirationally at least to 1.5 degrees Celsius, are to be effectuated by the parties making pledges of reducing emissions, right? These pledges are called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, right? And when we, what Article 4 tells us is that parties in taking those NDCs are to pursue domestic mitigation measures, right? So one question we have to ask ourselves is, would marine sequestration activities constitute a domestic mitigation measure that could be part of the NDCs of the parties, and one of the ways of them meeting their commitments under the treaty? Well, interestingly enough, the Paris Agreement doesn't define the term mitigation anywhere. Okay, but its parent agreement, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, does. And so if you look at Article 4 of the Framework Convention, it says that mitigation includes limiting anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases and protecting and enhancing greenhouse gas sinks and reservoirs. And so to the extent that marine sequestration or any carbon dioxide removal technology would enhance greenhouse gas sinks and reservoirs, I think it could be argued that it would be a mitigation measure that parties could include in their nationally determined contributions. And some discussion has already begun about the potential role of CDR in this context. Now, on the at the same time, if we start talking about these measures within the Paris Agreement, there are other provisions of Paris that may place the impacts of some of those technologies under scrutiny. And you can see some of these. This is the preamble, the introductory language to the treaty talks about recognizing parties may be affected not only by climate change, but also by the impacts of measures taken in response to it. So to the extent that these technologies, whether they be terrestrial or marine-based carbon dioxide removal approaches, potentially have negative impacts, they could be scrutinized by the parties to the Paris Convention. Okay. And most specifically in the preamble, it talks about the importance of ensuring, quote unquote, the integrity of all ecosystems, including oceans, and the protection of biodiversity. Okay? So it both provides a potential opportunity to utilize these processes and also may provide some checks in terms of the scope of these processes and the scale in which they're deployed if they potentially have negative impacts. Okay? And then the last thing I'd say is that there's a number of other treaties that potentially might also be relevant. One is called the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or Other Hostile Uses of Environmental Modification Techniques. This is the NMOD Convention, or the Weather Modification Convention. This is more likely to be important in the context of solar radiation management geoengineering, okay, given its potential for altering climate, okay? Probably less so in the context of carbon dioxide removal approaches. But there's been some arguments that, that some of these might also be scrutinized under that treaty. Another treaty that could become important in the future is the Law of the Sea Convention itself is developing a new treaty for, quote unquote, areas of biological diversity beyond national jurisdiction, so in the high seas. So to the extent that some of these marine sequestration activities could occur on the high seas, it is contemplated that the Law of the Sea Convention, and through this new sub-treaty, will establish more stringent measures for protecting that environment. And sequestration activities might be placed under increased scrutiny as a consequence in the future. Any activity that involves the Antarctic or the Southern Ocean, most prominently ocean iron fertilization, where the lion's share of the potential shortages in terms of iron would occur, would also trigger the protective mechanisms under the Antarctic Treaty Series. And so they'd be subject to transboundary environmental impact assessment and a risk assessment framework that has been established by the parties to that treaty. And then finally, we have more general international law principles that would be involved. The no harm rule, the idea that you can't use your land or areas under your jurisdiction to harm other countries. If you were engaged, for example, in ocean iron fertilization activities and it were to rob downstream areas of nutrients, which is one of the indictments of ocean iron fertilization, and it were to reduce productivity of fisheries, for example, arguably would violate this principle, and an action could be brought in an international tribunal to assess it. The precautionary principle indicates that we're in all cases where there's risks of potentially irreversible impacts, that we are to take precautionary measures. that is something that's been incorporated in a number of the risk assessment frameworks. The need for transboundary impact assessment and consultation. In many of these cases, these activities that we're talking about, mineral sequestration activities, for example, things such as ocean alkalization, could have impacts that would go beyond any individual nation's jurisdictional boundaries. And to the extent that there would be impacts on other actors, under international law, there would be an obligation to consult with them and to some degree take those interests in note, right? And so it would involve a balancing of interests of individual countries that would have to be resolved in some individual fora. Okay, so I'm going to stop with that and just say there's a large number of regimes that are already looking at these activities, and I would suggest that as they become more important and in the future, it's likely that these regimes are going to place these activities under far more scrutiny. In some ways, that's frightening to the scientists that work in this area, but at the same time, it's important that scientists engage and provide the kind of information that policymakers need to make these kind of determinations. Because if they don't, invariably there'll be a huge backlash against these activities, and it will slow down critical research and potential deployment in the future. And so as we develop these frameworks, it's going to be important for scientists and policymakers to proceed in good faith in determining what role, if any, these kind of activities will play in terms of addressing climate change in the future. Thank you.
Stay for one question.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one question directly for Will, and then we'll have group questions. Yes.
Is there any effort or intention to bring these conventions or protocols together?
Yeah. Yeah, no. Most of these treaties have developed independently of each other. They have their own bureaucracies, their own constituencies, and so even though in most cases you're talking about the same countries belonging to all of these treaties, it's often different ministries that represent their countries in these treaties that may have different interests and jealously guard that jurisdiction, right? The other thing is that often these individual treaties have different interests of the things that they think are most important. If you're the Paris Agreement, right, the most important thing to you is addressing climate change, right? If you're the London Dumping Convention, it's preserving ocean ecosystems. And there's obviously an overlap in some cases, but there's cases where there may be trade-offs that one regime would deem to be undesirable, and they won't cooperate. So what we've often seen when it's come to these kind of things is that one regime finally takes the lead and they consult with other regimes and they try to accommodate their interests also. But very rarely do you get a consolidated regulation. Climate change is a fairly rare exception, right, where most of the game is in the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement. But even in that case, a large amount of climate policy is done in the Montreal Protocol, which deals with ozone depletion, right, and some other regimes. And so it's likely that'll be true here too.
What would it take to make it happen?
Make consolidated regulation? I don't know. I think that it is possible that the London Convention, for example, and the CBD, who really doesn't want to be involved in this, would be willing to cede jurisdiction to the Paris Agreement if it were to establish protective measures that met the interests that are most important to them, that being species in the case of the CBD and ocean ecosystems in the case of the London Convention. But we're at such early stages of even talking about these options potentially being deployed that these regimes, because they have so many other issues that they have to address, these remain ancillary for all of those regimes in many ways.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. All right, please join me in, again, thanking Dr. Will Burns. Thank you. So we're going to have just a few more minutes left to ask both of our speakers some questions, so I'd like to invite them both back up to the front. I'll ask the first question, and then I want you to be thinking of your own question. And because we're so short on time, I want you to think of a question that you feel is relevant to the majority of the audience and that both of our speakers can answer. So keep that in mind, and then I know you're going to ask the most excellent question that I could possibly ask of you. I'm curious to ask you both, what makes you the most optimistic right now? As concisely as you can speak to it, what is something that you feel we all have reason to be very optimistic about right now?
Well, you know, when we started talking about climate issues in earnest in the 70s and 80s, and we projected where we thought temperatures would be by 2100, there were a lot of credible people, including the World Bank, the IEA, et cetera, who projected that temperatures might be as much as 6 degrees Celsius by 2100, right? And these were credible assessments. I think that what we've been doing in terms of the Framework Convention, the Paris Agreement, what we've been doing nationally, have substantially bent that curve, right? We're now talking about temperature increase of between 2.8, 3.5, right? Still well too much, right, for where we need to be, but substantially lower. And so I think that there's been substantial progress made and recognition that leads me to believe that with a little more work in this context, we might be able to get credibly near 2 degrees Celsius, and with better adaptation protocols, you know, not have catastrophic results by the end of the century.
So, whoops, I better get out of here. So, why am I optimistic, or why are there reasons to be optimistic about this? Well, I would say first off, the fact that you guys are here and that the profile of this problem is becoming more and more elevated. More and more people are becoming aware of this problem, which obviously is fundamental if we're actually going to do anything about this. In terms of the policies that we need to really get these kinds of actions and technologies going, I think there's a lot that needs to be done. But first off, we need to have awareness among the people, the citizens, that this is important. I think that's where it starts. So it's going to be a bottom-up, apparently, effort here. So I'm encouraged that you're here and a lot of other people are interested in this. I don't think I'm as optimistic as Will is that we're going to hit 2 degrees. I think right now I think it's extremely unlikely, just given where we are. We're so far behind in reducing our emissions, and there's so much importance being placed on carbon dioxide removal that is completely unproven. So I'm not terribly optimistic now, but there is, as long as we keep the lines of communication open, and as long as we're open-minded to exploring new ways of doing things, as well as encouraging those methods that already exist. For example, emissions reduction, renewable energy. We could do a lot there. And for lack of policy and other reasons, it hasn't happened. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm very concerned if we're going to actually do this 2 degree C effort. But we'll see, and we got to keep trying.
I think that's what's called keeping it real. So thank you for that. Okay, we have time for one more question. So if you think you're the one who has the most audience-relevant, pithy question, then raise your hand really high. Will we hear from Felix? Yes, in the back. Yes.
I want to ask you about scaling. For example, if you're talking about the scaling of the chemical geoengineering solution, what should be the scale of solution that will have an impact on the global carbon budget, and is it applicable at all in terms of international collaboration and, of course, energy and storage?
Yeah, well, obviously the scale is huge. I can't give you a square kilometers of ocean involved. In some cases, or many cases, that's not well known. in terms of, say, doing 10 gigatons of CO2 absorption. I would, off the top of my head, I would say that might take 5 to 10% of the ocean surface. Of course, obviously, you put something in the ocean, it diffuses. You may end up affecting the whole ocean, but it's going to be very large scale. The actual details of that need more R&D to really put hard numbers on that. But it's there's a lot that we don't know yet, both about the benefits and the impacts of doing that. So it remains to be seen how much we can do and what actually the scales that are required to do it. But it's going to be huge. And what's going to happen here is there's going to be a multiple, it's not going to be one thing that saves us. It's going to be a whole variety of things, terrestrial, ocean, and even things we haven't thought about yet. You know, I mentioned synthetic biology, genetic engineering, and on the abiotic side, there are all sorts of things like electrochemistry that I touched on. So I think all of those and many more are going to be required here, and we certainly need to explore all those to see what, in fact, our options are.
Will, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'd concur that we're probably talking about needing 10 to 15 gigs from CDR to get to where we are, which is why we also talk about solar radiation management, which in my mind is far more frightening proposition, but it's one of the reasons, because when we start looking at numbers like that, and I agree with Greg, it's going to be a portfolio. I mean, the early discussion of CDR was mostly on bioenergy and carbon capture, and we realized that at 10 to 12, that you were going to require, 25 to 30% of the primary productivity of Earth to do that, right? And you were going to have to double the amount of water that you currently use for irrigation, right? That ain't going to happen, right? So sensible people have started talking more about a portfolio, right, where we get 1 to 2 gigs from enhanced mineral weathering, perhaps 1 to 2 from direct air capture, some from the oceans, et cetera. One of the problems that we have with that is that requires a large amount of research and development funding. It also requires coordination among those approaches. Some of the approaches have trade-offs. If you're going to do large-scale bioenergy and capture, for example, and you want to simultaneously do reforestation, there's going to be competition for the resource. Same thing with biochar. And so who's going to coordinate that, and how we're going to assess where we get the most bang for the buck is an issue. And there's some of that also on the ocean side, right? And international institutions are poor in doing that. Policymakers and lawyers are often loath to listen to scientists and make political decisions that really don't reflect those assessments. And the problem is that if we were starting now and it was 1970 and we had lots of time to do this, I'd be more sanguine that we're going to do it in a rational and methodical fashion. But now, we're at the 11th and a half hour, right? And we have to act quickly, and we could act rashly in ways that are bad.
Thank you very much. I wish we had time for more questions. We are a little bit over, and I did promise everybody that there would still be a chance to meet each other. So I know that our speakers are going to hang out, and I imagine they'd be happy to continue to chat with you. I also encourage you to meet each other. There are many people in this room who could share this stage and speak at length and in depth about so many topics, whether it's marine sequestration, other forms of sequestration, other topics relating to climate change, and you'll find that out when we have a chance to get up. So. We will let you know when it's time to leave. We might start cleaning up underneath you if we take your chair. I hope you don't think it's us being rude. We're just doing our job. But stay until we tell you to go. Please have more drinks. Please have more snacks. And most importantly, thank you again to Schmidt Marine for hosting us, to Michael for being such a gracious host, and of course to Dr. Will Burns and Dr. Greg Rao. Please help me thank them one more time for speaking this evening. Thank you for being here. Good night, everybody.